Benny Hill's shattered coffin was entombed under heavy industrial concrete just to stop grave robbers seeking tabloid-rumored gold. It was a bleak finale for the creator of The Benny Hill Show. Despite making Thames Television billions with characters like Fred Scuttle, Hill died rotting in a filthy armchair, completely ignoring a £10 million fortune. The true thieves weren't at the cemetery. They were the executives who fired him in a sterile 30-minute meeting. They sanitized their corporate image for government regulators, aggressively exported his reruns globally, and abandoned their biggest star to a fatal psychological collapse. Thames Television was born in 1968, a corporate entity specifically designed to hold the lucrative weekday broadcasting franchise for London. The executives sitting in those newly furnished offices had a strict mandate to generate immediate revenue and justify their operating license to the government regulators. They poached Benny Hill from the BBC in 1969 with a massive financial offer and a promise of total creative control over his productions. The network suits executed a calculated acquisition of a proven ratings draw, bypassing any artistic considerations. They needed a highly reliable product to anchor their light entertainment division, and Hill was the safest, most bankable bet on the market. The format of the program was an executive's absolute dream scenario, bypassing expensive location shoots, complex continuity, and high-priced guest stars. The Benny Hill Show operated as a fast-paced sketch show built entirely around the leading man, utilizing a small salaried repertory company of supporting actors. The sets were built cheaply on sound stages in Teddington, often using recycled materials and props from other Thames Television productions. The financial overhead was shockingly low compared to the massive domestic audience it commanded on a Thursday night. But the real financial genius of the operation was the heavy reliance on silent physical comedy. A massive portion of every episode consisted of high-speed chases, physical slapstick, and visual gags set to a jaunty saxophone track. This was not just a stylistic choice by the performer. It was a brilliant, highly effective masterclass in international television distribution. Verbal comedy requires expensive dubbing sessions or subtitles, and specific cultural references rarely translate across borders. A man getting hit in the face with a pie or chased by a mob of angry women is universally understood without a single translated line of dialogue. Thames Television's international sales department quickly realized they were sitting on a corporate gold mine. Because the physical comedy required zero translation, the syndication tapes could be shipped directly from London to anywhere on the planet with a broadcasting tower. Throughout the 1970s, the sales executives were cutting massive licensing deals in territories that had traditionally ignored British television imports. They sold the broadcast rights to stations in France, Germany, Spain, and eventually over 140 different countries. The foreign exchange started pouring into the Thames corporate accounts at an entirely unprecedented rate. The ultimate prize for any British broadcaster was the United States, a market notoriously resistant to imported European comedy. Network executives in New York and Los Angeles usually preferred to purchase the rights and remake British shows with American actors rather than air the originals. The Benny Hill Show bypassed the major American networks entirely and targeted the local independent UHF channels. These smaller stations were desperate for cheap, attention-grabbing content to run late at night to compete against the major network talk shows. Thames Television packaged the half-hour episodes and sold them into the American syndication market through a savvy distributor named Don Taffner. The American distribution strategy was brutally effective and highly lucrative. By the late 1970s, Benny Hill was airing every single night in major media markets like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Local station managers realized that programming Hill at 11 p.m. resulted in massive ratings spikes among young male demographics. Advertisers followed the viewers, allowing these independent stations to charge premium rates for commercial spots during the half-hour broadcast. Thames Television collected their hefty licensing fees, taking a massive cut of the American advertising boom without having to film a single frame of new footage. The sheer volume of cash generated a culture of absolute complicity within Thames Television. Decades later, television historians would attempt to claim the network was privately embarrassed by the bawdy humor, but the production budgets prove otherwise. Every sketch featuring scantily clad women was sanctioned, funded, and explicitly approved by executives before a camera ever rolled. If a routine pushed the boundaries of domestic broadcast standards, the suits did not shut it down. They checked the foreign sales projections to ensure it would sell in Italy or Japan. Benny Hill was the industrial engine keeping the corporate structure solvent, and the network effectively operated as a highly efficient corporatized vaudeville machine. The cultural footprint of the show extended far beyond the late-night working-class viewing audience. The industry elites, the exact people who supposedly demanded high art, were privately consuming the product on a massive scale. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted and respected news anchor in America, publicly admitted that he never missed a broadcast of the program. Major Hollywood stars like Burt Reynolds and Michael Caine made a point of visiting the production set when they were working in London. The program was universally acknowledged as a masterpiece of comic timing and physical execution by the people who actually worked inside the entertainment business. The ultimate validation for the network came from the founding father of physical comedy himself. Charlie Chaplin, living in strict exile in Switzerland, was notoriously protective of his legacy and highly critical of modern television performers. Yet Chaplin was an avid, obsessive fan of The Benny Hill Show and monitored it closely. When Hill visited Chaplin's private estate in the 1970s, he discovered that the silent film legend had an extensive, highly curated collection of his Thames Television broadcasts. Chaplin recognized the technical brilliance of the high-speed chases and the precision of the visual gags, viewing Hill as the sole legitimate inheritor of the silent comedy tradition. That specific endorsement alone cemented Hill's status as an untouchable asset within the company. If the greatest physical comedian of the 20th century validated the work, the suits at Thames Television had no grounds to ever question the artistic merit. They simply kept cashing the syndication checks and renewing the production contracts without hesitation. The network essentially built an impenetrable corporate fortress around their star, shielding him from any domestic criticism as long as the international market continued to expand. It was a perfectly functional, mutually beneficial corporate marriage that generated billions of dollars. The global reach of the program created surreal, almost unbelievable intersections of pop culture. By the late 1980s, the most famous and heavily guarded entertainer on the planet was Michael Jackson, riding the massive commercial wave of his global stadium tours. Jackson was completely insulated, surrounded by handlers, and largely disconnected from normal, everyday human interaction. Yet, he possessed an obsessive, deeply ingrained fandom for British slapstick comedy and owned hundreds of hours of Thames programming. During a massive stadium tour in the United Kingdom, Jackson suffered a minor health issue and was admitted to a private London hospital. At that exact same time, Benny Hill was recovering from a mild heart scare in a different wing of the very same hospital building. When Jackson's security team informed him of this fact, the pop star immediately altered his strict security protocols and demanded to visit the aging comedian. The hospital staff cleared the hallways as Jackson, dressed in his full military-style stage regalia, walked directly into the room of a 60-something British television star. Jackson spent over an hour sitting by the bed, discussing the specific timing of comedy sketches and expressing his absolute reverence for the physical routines. This level of global adoration constantly reinforced the executive mindset at Thames Television. The syndication deals had turned Benny Hill into a universally recognized brand, sitting alongside American corporate giants in terms of sheer global penetration. The network built its entire financial forecasting model around the physical stamina of one man, erecting an impenetrable corporate fortress to protect the asset. Thames Television operated a legally sanctioned protection racket, weaponizing their massive export earnings to silence domestic critics. They deliberately shielded Hill from the rapidly changing cultural tides of the 1980s, prioritizing the profitable filming schedule over acknowledging reality. The executives operated under the arrogant assumption that financial capital guaranteed absolute corporate security, failing to realize they had built their empire directly on a cultural fault line. The trap had been set over 20 long years of total corporate complicity. Thames Television had funded, protected, and encouraged a specific type of comedy until it became fundamentally tied to their corporate identity. When the political winds shifted, they could not simply distance themselves from the product. They were the product. The executives had built the bomb, profited from it for 2 decades, and were now completely oblivious to the ticking sound echoing through their own hallways. The final critical error was a complete failure of basic human empathy. The executives viewed Benny Hill strictly as a highly profitable line item on a budget sheet. They never considered the psychological toll of forcing a man to perform the exact same physical routines well into his late 60s. They never accounted for the fact that the machine they were running was entirely dependent on a mortal, aging human being. They assumed the asset would simply continue to perform on command until they decided it was time to pull the plug. The shift in the industry functioned as a hostile, calculated takeover by a new generation rather than a natural evolution of taste. By the mid-1980s, the British comedy scene was being flooded by university-educated writers and performers. This was the birth of the alternative comedy movement, a highly aggressive, politically motivated faction of the entertainment business. They did not play the old variety halls or traditional theaters. They built their audiences in cramped, smoky pubs, and their entire brand identity was positioned as a direct attack on the old guard. To these new performers, the old school physical slapstick of the 1970s was not just outdated, it was viewed as the enemy. They weaponized the changing social standards to clear out the older generation and claim the prime television slots for themselves. The easiest, most visible target for this cultural hit job was the man pulling in the biggest audience numbers. Benny Hill became the primary punching bag for every young, politically conscious comedian trying to make a name for themselves in the London press. The television critics in the major British newspapers immediately smelled blood in the water. Conflict sells print, and the narrative of the progressive youth dismantling the outdated dinosaur was too good to ignore. The reviews of his show shifted almost overnight from minor complaints about repetitive jokes to outright hostile accusations. Critics began uniformly labeling his programs as deeply sexist, misogynistic, and actively harmful to the modern social fabric. They stopped reviewing the execution of the physical comedy and started reviewing his programming as a moral failing. This sudden media shift terrified the management structure at Thames Television. The network executives were not artists, and they certainly did not care about the moral implications of a comedy sketch. Their sole concern was risk management and protecting the corporate balance sheet. They watched as their most reliable cash generator was slowly transformed by the press into a massive public relations liability. The timing of this cultural backlash could not have been worse for the people sitting in the boardroom. The entire existence of Thames Television hinged on a very fragile legal document, the broadcasting franchise license. In the United Kingdom, commercial networks did not own the airwaves permanently. Every few years, they were forced to reapply for their licenses in front of a government regulatory body known as the Independent Broadcasting Authority. If the regulators decided a network was failing to meet modern broadcasting standards, they could simply revoke the license. This meant the network would instantly cease to exist, the screens would go black, and the executives would be out on the street. As the 1989 franchise renewal approached, a cold institutional panic took over the Thames executive suite. The new head of the network, a risk-averse executive named Richard Dunn, realized they had a massive problem. The government regulators were actively circulating a confidential memo demanding a definitive break from the past, heavily influenced by the upscale newspaper critics, currently tearing the network's biggest comedy star to shreds. Dunn and his management team knew they had to walk into the renewal hearings with a completely sanitized, modern corporate image. They needed a highly public sacrifice to prove that broadcasting standards were actually changing. The calculation made in the boardroom was ruthless and purely mathematical. The executives weighed the massive international syndication revenue against the risk of losing the entire broadcasting network. The choice was obvious. They were more than willing to sever a highly profitable arm to save the corporate body. The decision to terminate the most successful comedian in the history of the company was finalized weeks before the man himself even knew his contract was in danger. In June 1989, a secretary placed a call to the Teddington production offices. Benny Hill was summoned to the Thames Television headquarters for a meeting with the head of Light Entertainment, John Howard Davies. Hill walked into the building expecting a completely routine conversation. His most recent season had just aired to over 9 million domestic viewers, an audience size modern television networks aggressively compete for. He assumed the executives wanted to discuss the budget for the upcoming year, or perhaps negotiate the terms of a new international special. He was a man who still believed the old rules of the business applied. If you bring in the audience, the network protects you. He took the elevator up to the executive floors completely blind to the corporate trap that had been set. The meeting that followed is a masterclass in the sheer brutality of the modern entertainment industry. It did not take hours of fierce negotiation, and there was no shouting or dramatic desk pounding. The entire execution took less than 30 minutes. Davies sat behind his desk and delivered the rehearsed corporate talking points with clinical precision. There were no transition period offered, no discussion of revamping the show's format, and no opportunity for the aging star to defend his work. He was simply informed that his contract would not be renewed and his services were no longer required by the network. After 20 years of generating billions of dollars, carrying the light entertainment division, and funding the network's prestige projects, he was fired in a single, sterile conversation. The executives bypassed any final season or farewell special to wrap up his legacy. That kind of tribute would have contradicted their strategy for the government regulators. They needed to execute a clean, immediate break to show the authorities they were serious about sanitizing their schedule. Hill was escorted out of the office before the shock could even fully register in his system. He walked back onto the London streets a completely unemployed performer, entirely severed from the only machine he knew how to operate. The speed and coldness of the firing left his entire production crew completely stunned. Camera operators, lighting technicians, and supporting actors who had relied on the show for their livelihood were suddenly out of work without warning. But the network suits did not care about the collateral damage to the crew. Their only objective was controlling the narrative in the press. The Thames Television Public Relations Department immediately went to work, spinning the termination to their advantage. They leaked the news to the exact same television critics who had been demanding the cancellation. The PR strategy was designed to make the network look heroic and decisive. They framed the firing as a bold corporate stand for modern values, proudly announcing that Thames Television would no longer broadcast outdated sexist material. The executives essentially threw their biggest star to the media wolves, allowing his reputation to be torn apart while they positioned themselves as the saviors of British broadcasting standards. The corporate reality operating behind the press releases revealed the unfiltered hypocrisy of the television business. While executives publicly condemned the show as a national embarrassment to appease domestic regulators, the international sales division received quiet instructions to continue pushing the exact same syndication packages abroad. Thames Television operated a highly lucrative double ledger. They purchased their domestic political safety by throwing their biggest star to the media wolves, while simultaneously cashing syndication checks from independent stations in Chicago and Tokyo. They viewed the comedian strictly as a depreciating asset, stripping him of his studio access while keeping a tight grip on his intellectual property. They essentially evicted the tenant, but kept aggressively collecting the rent. The cultural narrative had been successfully hijacked by the alternative comedy movement, rendering him completely toxic overnight in his own country. No major British executive stepped forward to defend his legacy or offer him a lifeline. While American producers immediately offered lucrative contracts to relocate his production to the United States, prioritizing syndication numbers over London newspaper critics, the fatal wound had already been inflicted. As he walked away from the Thames headquarters, he was entirely unaware that his forced exile would rapidly trigger a catastrophic physical decline. To survive in the upper echelons of the television business, a performer requires a massive, highly efficient support system. A weekly primetime show is an industrial operation that dictates exactly when a star wakes up, what they wear, what they say, and when they are allowed to eat. The network provides drivers, makeup artists, lighting technicians, caterers, and publicists to manage every single aspect of the talent's existence. When you operate inside this bubble for 2 decades, you slowly lose the ability to manage your own life. The studio effectively becomes a surrogate parent, handling all the complex logistics of the outside world. Benny Hill was the ultimate product of this institutionalized environment. Unlike other massive stars of his era, he never established a parallel life outside of the Thames Television complex. He had absolutely no safety net of domestic normalcy to fall back on when the cameras stopped rolling. He remained unmarried, without children, and avoided serious long-term romantic relationships. His entire emotional capacity was poured directly into the production of physical comedy, leaving nothing left for a private life. His entire psychological reality was anchored to the geography of the Teddington studios. The camera operators, the sound engineers, and the wardrobe assistants were his only functional social circle. In the brutal reality of the entertainment industry, a film crew is a highly temporary family held together entirely by weekly paychecks. You spend 16 hours a day in high-stress environments, sharing an intense artificial intimacy with people you barely know. When the production wraps, the crew immediately packs up and moves on to the next paying gig without a second thought. Hill completely failed to understand the transactional nature of this relationship. He genuinely believed the people working on his set were his lifelong friends, permanently attached to his orbit. When the network executives terminated his contract in that 30-minute meeting, they did not just cancel his television show. They instantly dissolved his entire social network and physically barred him from the only building where he felt safe. The crew members, needing to pay their mortgages and feed their families, simply took new jobs on different Thames productions. The morning after the firing, the reality of his isolation finally materialized. For the first time in 20 years, there was no production call sheet slipped under his apartment door. There was no company car waiting on the street, no script read through scheduled, and no wardrobe fittings to attend. The massive, well-oiled corporate machine that had organized his every waking moment was suddenly switched off. He was a 65-year-old man waking up in a cheap rental flat with absolutely no instructions on what to do next. A normal executive or actor with a £10 million severance package would immediately book a flight to a private island or buy an estate in the country. Hill had no idea how to do either of those things. He lacked a well-stamped passport and the social circle required for international travel. The money sitting in his accounts was completely useless because his only interest in life was writing and filming comedy sketches. Stripped of his studio, the wealth was just a theoretical number on a bank statement. Without the grueling schedule to keep him occupied, he began to physically deteriorate almost immediately. He morphed into a highly recognizable ghost, haunting the streets of suburban London. Witnesses routinely spotted him walking for miles without any clear destination, wearing the exact same frayed clothing for days at a time. He would often carry cheap plastic grocery bags filled with old scripts, loose notes, and discounted food he bought at local supermarkets. He looked exactly like a homeless pensioner, despite being one of the wealthiest men in the city. The psychological toll of being famous without having a platform is a very specific type of torture. He was recognized by fans everywhere he walked, but he had no new material to promote and no studio backing his status. People would approach him on the street, expecting the energetic body comedian they saw on their television screens. Instead, they found a quiet, deeply depressed man shuffling down the pavement clutching a plastic bag. These interactions served as constant, painful reminders of the empire he had just lost. He would often sit alone in cheap working-class cafes, staring blankly out the window for hours. He was surrounded by the exact same demographic that had made him a global superstar, but he was completely disconnected from them. He was mourning the loss of his career in plain sight, entirely unprotected by the network public relations team that used to manage his image. The paparazzi quickly realized he was an easy target and began stalking him during his long walks. The British tabloids published cruel, highly unflattering photos of the former king of comedy looking confused and entirely washed up. The Thames executives watched this public humiliation unfold from their London offices and did absolutely nothing. They had successfully discarded the liability and secured their own corporate survival, leaving their former star to deal with the psychological fallout alone. They did not offer him access to company therapists, and they did not issue any statements defending his current state. The network maintained a strict, cold silence, allowing the press to slowly destroy the remnants of his public dignity. He was collateral damage in a corporate restructuring, and the company had already moved on to the next quarter. The ultimate tragedy of this period is that he still possessed massive market value outside of the United Kingdom. As the British press was destroying him, American television producers were actively trying to locate him. The independent syndication market in the United States was still generating millions of dollars off his old episodes. American network executives saw a massive opportunity to sign a global star who had just become a free agent. They started sending lucrative multi-million-dollar contract offers directly to his agents. These American executives offered to fly him to Los Angeles, build him a brand new production facility, and give him total creative control. They wanted to recreate the exact same physical comedy format that Thames Television had just canceled. For a normal entertainer, this would be the ultimate revenge scenario. It was a chance to instantly rebuild the empire, double the salary, and prove the British critics entirely wrong. The American offers were a guaranteed lifeline out of his depression, but you cannot transplant a deeply institutionalized man across the ocean. Hill rejected every single American offer that crossed his desk. He was a creature of habit who rarely left his own neighborhood, let alone his own country. He was terrified of the Los Angeles studio system, the aggressive American executives, and the prospect of working with a completely foreign camera crew. He knew deep down that he could not replicate the specific magic without his exact team of British technicians and actors. The rejection of these contracts was an admission of total defeat. He realized that the machine he needed to survive could only exist inside the Thames Television building in London. No amount of American money could rebuild the exact environment he required to function. By turning down the Los Angeles deals, he permanently closed the door on his own career. He accepted that if he could not work for Thames, he was never going to work again. This realization shattered whatever remaining psychological defenses he had left. The long walks across London slowly began to shorten. The energy required to wander the streets, dodge the paparazzi, and interact with fans completely evaporated. The outside world had become entirely too hostile and complicated for a man who only understood the controlled environment of a soundstage. He began to retreat back to the only place where nobody could ask him about his canceled show. He returned to the small rented apartment at Fairwater House in Teddington. The physical boundaries of his world shrank from the global stage to the streets of London, and finally to a few hundred square feet of cheap carpet. He locked the front door, drew the curtains shut against the daylight, and effectively resigned from the human race. The forced exile initiated by the network was about to enter its final fatal phase. The psychological destruction was complete, and the physical strike against his own body was about to begin. When a television network officially revokes your studio access, they do not just take away the cameras, they remove the entire structural framework that dictates your physical health. For a physical comedian, the body is not just a biological vessel, it is a highly tuned piece of industrial equipment. For 2 decades, Benny Hill's physical condition was meticulously maintained by the demands of the production schedule. He had to be light on his feet, capable of sprinting through outdoor locations, and agile enough to execute complex slapstick timing. The network essentially forced him to stay alive and active because a sick asset cannot generate foreign syndication revenue. The moment the executives abruptly severed his contract in that sterile office, the physical maintenance schedule was instantly abandoned. Hill no longer had a corporate mandate to stay in shape, and he had no personal desire to maintain an instrument that was no longer required to play. He initiated what can only be described as a brutal, highly effective physical strike against his own biology. He locked the door to his rented apartment in Teddington and completely surrendered to a diet of cheap, high-calorie convenience foods. He was a multi-millionaire ordering mass quantities of junk food, deliberately insulating himself from the outside world with layers of physical weight. This was not a case of a man simply letting himself go in retirement. This was a calculated, passive self-destruction. He began consuming food with the exact same obsessive, repetitive focus he used to apply to his comedy sketches. Within a matter of months, his physical appearance altered drastically, ballooning to nearly 300 pounds. The rapid weight gain placed a massive, entirely unsustainable strain on his aging cardiovascular system. He was intentionally overloading the machinery, forcing his heart to pump blood through a rapidly expanding body that rarely moved from the living room armchair. In the entertainment business, a sudden physical decline in a major star usually triggers an immediate intervention from management. Agents, publicists, and studio executives will typically force an actor into luxury rehabilitation facilities to protect their financial investment. But Benny Hill had no corporate sponsors left to protect him. The executives at Thames Television were entirely focused on their franchise renewal and had already written him off as a terminated liability. There was no panicked phone call from the boardroom demanding he see a specialist because nobody in the corporate hierarchy cared if he lived or died. The biological reality of his lifestyle caught up with him in February 1992, 2 months before he would be found dead. He suffered a serious cardiac event that finally forced him out of his armchair and into the Royal Brompton Hospital. The medical staff ran a battery of sophisticated diagnostic tests on the former television star. The results were completely unambiguous and entirely fatal if left untreated. His coronary arteries were severely blocked, his heart muscle was suffocating, and his circulatory system was on the verge of total collapse. The cardiologists at the Royal Brompton were highly experienced and delivered a cold, factual ultimatum. They informed him that he required an immediate, massive coronary bypass surgery to clear the blockages. They explained the mechanics of the procedure, the recovery timeline, and the absolute certainty of a terminal cardiac event if he refused the operation. They expected the wealthy, globally recognized celebrity to immediately sign the consent forms and book the best private surgical suite available. Instead, Hill listened to their diagnosis, shook his head, and flatly refused the surgery. This refusal completely baffled the medical establishment, but it made perfect sense to anyone who understood the psychology of a discarded performer. A coronary bypass surgery requires a massive commitment to post-operative recovery, physical therapy, and a strict adherence to a new lifestyle. It requires a fundamental desire to extend your own life. Hill looked at the prospect of surviving the surgery and realized it only meant returning to the exact same isolated, purposeless existence in his Teddington flat. He did not want to endure the brutal pain of having his chest cracked open just to buy more time sitting alone in an armchair. He signed the medical discharge papers against the strict advice of his doctors and walked out of the hospital. It was a conscious, deliberate choice to let the clock run out on his own terms. He was entirely aware that the blocked arteries were a ticking time bomb, but he preferred the certainty of a fatal cardiac event over the agonizingly slow decay of public exile. By refusing the surgical intervention, he effectively finalized his own fate, choosing a passive exit via medical neglect. He returned to his apartment, sat back down in front of the television, and simply waited for his cardiovascular system to fail. When the fatal coronary thrombosis finally arrived in April, the immediate reaction from the British television industry was a masterclass in corporate hypocrisy. The exact same executives and media critics who had spent the last 3 years destroying his reputation suddenly reversed their positions. The network suits who had ruthlessly fired him in a 30-minute meeting began issuing somber press releases praising his comedic genius. The newspapers that had branded him a sexist dinosaur suddenly printed massive glowing obituaries calling him a national treasure. The industry effortlessly pivoted from character assassination to professional mourning without missing a single beat. This post-mortem rebranding was driven entirely by the realization that his death was dominating the global news cycle. Thames Television realized that the international syndication buyers were closely watching the coverage. The network could not afford to look callous or ungrateful, so they engaged in a heavily orchestrated campaign of public grief. They aired tribute specials, carefully editing out the fact that they were the exact institution that had driven him into isolation. They successfully whitewashed the brutality of his firing, repackaging his legacy into a clean, highly profitable posthumous narrative. The funeral arrangements were handled quietly, a stark contrast to the massive global footprint of his television career. He was buried at Hollybrook Cemetery in his hometown of Southampton, a sprawling, unremarkable municipal graveyard on the southern coast of England. The ceremony was attended by a small circle of surviving family members, a few loyal friends from his production crew, and the obligatory network representatives sent to maintain appearances. There were no massive crowds lining the streets and no state honors. The king of global syndication was lowered into the earth in a standard wooden casket, entirely disconnected from the billions of dollars he had generated. However, the British tabloid machine was not finished extracting content from his corpse. In the months following the funeral, the cheap, sensationalist newspapers began running a series of highly speculative, entirely baseless articles about his estate. They seized on the paradox of his extreme wealth and his frugal lifestyle. The tabloids started publishing wild rumors that the eccentric, miserly comedian had refused to leave his fortune to his extended family. They printed entirely fabricated stories suggesting he had demanded to be buried wearing massive amounts of heavy gold jewelry and priceless physical assets. These articles were designed to generate cheap controversy and sell papers at the checkout counters, but they had a highly dangerous real-world consequence. When you print rumors of buried treasure in a national newspaper, you are actively broadcasting a target to the criminal underworld. The local pubs in Southampton began buzzing with the idea that the Hollybrook Cemetery was currently holding a wooden box filled with millions of pounds in untraceable gold. The television network had stripped him of his career, the press had stripped him of his dignity, and now the tabloids were setting the stage to strip him of his physical remains. The inevitable consequence of this media recklessness occurred just 6 months after the funeral. In October 1992, under the cover of a freezing pitch-black autumn night, a group of local criminals breached the perimeter of Hollybrook Cemetery. This was not a random act of vandalism by bored teenagers. It was a highly targeted, physically demanding industrial operation. The thieves brought heavy steel shovels, pickaxes, and crowbars. They completely bypassed the hundreds of other graves and walked directly to the freshly settled plot belonging to the former Thames Television star. Grave robbing is an incredibly laborious and time-consuming process. The thieves had to physically displace hundreds of pounds of compacted earth in the dark, working quickly to avoid the random patrols of local law enforcement. They dug down into the soil, tearing through the floral tributes and the settling dirt until their shovels finally struck the solid wood of the casket. They did not attempt to carefully excavate the box or extract it from the ground. They simply used the heavy steel pickaxes to violently smash through the reinforced wooden lid right where it sat in the earth. The reality of what they encountered inside that shattered casket is the darkest, most degrading chapter of the entire Benny Hill narrative. A human body buried in a standard wooden box for 6 months is in an advanced, highly volatile state of biological decomposition. Driven entirely by tabloid rumors of buried gold, they breached the shattered coffin and extracted the decaying remains. They dragged the corpse into the muddy soil beside the open grave to conduct their search. They tore through the rotting fabric of his burial suit, desperately patting down the decomposing tissue in search of heavy chains, gold watches, or hidden cash. They checked the surrounding lining of the smashed casket, digging their hands into the ruined upholstery. They spent an unknown amount of time desecrating the physical remains of a man who had once commanded an audience of millions. After thoroughly searching the body in the box, the thieves realized the brutal truth. The tabloids had lied. The hidden fortune was a myth. They found only the decaying remains of an old man in a cheap suit. The criminals abandoned the site immediately, leaving the shattered coffin exposed and the body thrown carelessly back into the shallow dirt. They fled into the night, completely empty-handed, leaving behind a scene of absolute, unimaginable desecration. He could not find peace in his rented apartment, and thanks to the sheer greed of the rumor mill, he could not even secure a few months of peace at the bottom of a 6-foot hole. The cemetery groundskeepers discovered the horrifying scene the following morning. They found the freshly turned earth, the splintered wood, and the exposed remains. The local Southampton police were immediately dispatched to secure the crime scene. The officers strung up yellow police tape around the gravestone of a man whose face had once been broadcast into American living rooms every single night. The forensic teams processed the area, but the thieves had left no usable evidence behind in the mud. The authorities were left with the grim logistical problem of what to do with the heavily damaged corpse. The local council realized that simply repairing the casket and filling the hole with dirt would not solve the problem. The tabloid rumors of the buried gold were still circulating, and if they reburied him normally, another gang of thieves would likely try again the following month. They had to execute a drastic, permanent security measure to protect the asset. The police authorized the cemetery staff to dig the hole significantly deeper, dropping the shattered remnants of the casket further into the water table. Bypassing a standard burial, the authorities ordered a heavy industrial cement mixer directly onto the pristine lawns of the Hollybrook Cemetery. The workers positioned the chute over the open grave and poured a massive half-meter-thick slab of solid, quick-drying concrete directly over the casket. They entombed the king of television under thousands of pounds of gray industrial aggregate. It was a cold, brutal, an entirely necessary architectural solution to a problem created entirely by the media. The concrete slab hardened beneath the soil, finally providing the absolute isolation that Hill had been seeking during the last 3 years of his life. Nobody could reach him to offer a bad contract, nobody could demand a new script, and no thieves could ever touch his remains again. He was permanently locked away from the industry that had used him, broken him, and discarded him. The massive weight of the cement ensured that the physical asset was finally, officially off the market. While the cemetery workers smoothed the dirt over the freshly poured concrete in Southampton, a massive corporate reckoning was quietly building back in London. The executives at Thames Television had spent 3 years believing they had successfully rigged the corporate game. They fired their most profitable star, sanitized their broadcast schedule, and presented themselves to the government regulators as a thoroughly modern entity. They assumed this calculated human sacrifice was the exact payment required to secure their broadcasting future for another decade. They completely failed to realize the government had aggressively changed the rules of the auction while they were busy managing their public relations. The corporate executioners were suddenly standing on the trapdoor. The restructuring of the British television industry in the early 1990s was driven strictly by free market economics, not moral broadcasting standards. Margaret Thatcher's government passed a new Broadcasting Act which fundamentally dismantled the old, subjective, regulatory framework. The government was no longer interested in judging a network solely on the prestige of its programming or its progressive cultural values. The regional broadcasting licenses were simply put up for a blind financial auction to the highest corporate bidder. Thames Television had destroyed the life of a global comedy icon to appease a regulatory system that was already obsolete. The blind auction meant the incumbent networks had to submit a sealed financial bid to retain their rights to broadcast. If a rival corporation submitted a higher number, the incumbent network was immediately liquidated regardless of their operational history. The Thames executives, heavily insulated by decades of massive profits and industry arrogance, drastically miscalculated their financial position. They submitted a bid of £32 million, firmly believing their established physical infrastructure made them entirely too big to fail. It was a massive strategic error born from the exact same corporate hubris that allowed them to casually discard their biggest star. A rival media conglomerate named Carlton Communications saw the massive vulnerability and struck with ruthless financial precision. Carlton had no massive studio complexes, no established stars, and no history of producing premium television content. They were essentially a well-funded corporate shell company looking to buy a highly lucrative regional monopoly. Carlton submitted a sealed bid of £43 million, outbidding Thames Television by an overwhelming financial margin. The government regulators opened the envelopes, looked at the raw numbers, and immediately handed the London weekday broadcasting rights to the highest bidder. The public announcement was a catastrophic shock to the entire Thames Television infrastructure. The executives who had coldly orchestrated the Benny Hill termination suddenly found themselves staring at complete corporate annihilation. Their strategy to survive by sacrificing their biggest domestic asset had achieved absolutely nothing. The government regulators took the £43 million from Carlton and officially revoked the Thames broadcasting license. The network that had dominated British television for a quarter of a century was legally ordered to cease operations and vacate the public airwaves. The transition of power was swift, highly clinical, and completely devoid of any industry sentimentality. Carlton Communications did not buy the Thames production facilities or hire their thousands of experienced employees. They simply bought the legal right to broadcast and began outsourcing all their production to cheaper, non-union independent contractors. The massive Teddington studios, the exact buildings where Benny Hill had generated billions of dollars in foreign revenue, were suddenly rendered completely obsolete. Thousands of technicians, camera operators, and producers lost their careers overnight as the new owners cleared the books. The executive suite at Thames faced an immediate and highly public corporate reckoning. The exact same men who had coolly discarded an aging global icon without a second thought were now receiving their own termination notices. The corporate board dissolved the management structure, aggressively liquidating the company's physical assets to satisfy the remaining shareholders. The highly paid executives were forced to pack up their corner offices and walk out into the London streets, entirely stripped of their industry power. They learned the exact same brutal lesson they had taught their star. The machine does not care about your past contributions. The collapse of Thames Television finalized a brutal corporate cycle. The network built its empire on the physical stamina of one performer, discarding him to preserve their status. 3 years later, a larger entity calculated a better profit margin and severed Thames's operational license with equal precision. As the brand was wiped from the airwaves, the Teddington studios were systematically stripped of their broadcasting history. The physical geography of the Comedy King's operational existence was permanently erased. The machine simply identifies the failing component, extracts it, and drops it on the pavement without hesitation. The remains were finally guarded under a heavy slab of concrete in Southampton. Yet the independent syndication market continued to force his digital ghost to work the late shift, exploiting the intellectual property long after the physical asset expired.